Nobody expected the newest nurse at City Memorial Hospital to be the one who'd solve the mystery that had stumped 20 of the best doctors in the country. But sometimes the answers we're looking for aren't hidden in test results or medical textbooks. Sometimes they're hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who knows how to truly listen. Sarah Chen was 26 years old and had been a registered nurse for exactly 3 weeks when she walked into the pediatric wing on a Monday morning that would change 2 lives forever. She was nervous, still learning the ropes, still trying to prove she belonged among the veteran staff who'd been doing this for decades. She had no idea that by the end of the week, she'd accomplished something that millions of dollars in medical technology and the most experienced doctors in the state couldn't manage. The case everyone was talking about involved a 10-year-old boy named Christopher Whitmore. His father, Richard Whitmore, was one of the wealthiest men in the city. Tech mogul, real estate investor, the kind of guy whose name appeared in business magazines and charity galas. Money was no object. When his son got sick, Richard brought in the best of the best. Specialists from Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, even flew in a diagnostician from Switzerland. 20 doctors, hundreds of tests, millions of dollars spent, and nobody could figure out what was wrong. Christopher had been in the hospital for 2 weeks, and every day was the same nightmare. The boy would lie in his bed, tears streaming down his face, his body rigid with obvious pain. But he never made a sound, never cried out, never screamed, never spoke. He just wept silently, his small hands gripping the sheets, his eyes squeezed shut. The doctors ran every test imaginable: MRIs, CT scans, blood work, neurological exams. Everything came back normal. Physically, according to every piece of technology they had, Christopher was perfectly healthy. The head pediatrician, Dr. Marcus Webb, had finally suggested what no parent wants to hear. Maybe it's psychological. Maybe the pain isn't real. Maybe the boy needs a psychiatrist, not a surgeon. Richard Whitmore had exploded at that suggestion. His son was suffering. Anyone could see that. The pain was real. But without a medical explanation, the doctors were running out of options. They'd consulted with pain management specialists, psychologists, even alternative medicine practitioners. Nothing helped. Christopher continued to suffer in silence. Sarah's first shift on the pediatric floor started with the usual orientation. The charge nurse, Patricia, walked her through the wing, introducing her to patients and families. When they reached Christopher's room, Patricia's voice dropped. "That's the Whitmore case. Everyone's talking about it. 20 doctors can't figure out what's wrong with him. The father's losing his mind. Honestly, it's above your pay grade, so don't worry about it. Just stay out of the way if you see doctors coming and going." But Sarah couldn't stay out of the way. She was assigned to check vitals for all the patients on the floor, including Christopher. When she walked into his room that first time, she found him exactly as everyone had described. Lying in bed, silent tears running down his cheeks, his whole body tense. His father sat in a chair beside the bed, looking exhausted and defeated. Richard Whitmore was usually the kind of man who commanded every room he entered. Right now, he looked small and helpless. Sarah approached the bed slowly, speaking softly. "Hi, Christopher. My name is Sarah. I'm a nurse here. I need to check your vital signs, okay? I'll be as gentle as I can." The boy didn't respond, didn't even open his eyes. Sarah took his temperature, checked his pulse, noted his blood pressure, all normal. Physically, there was nothing wrong. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was missing something obvious. She finished her checks and was about to leave when she noticed something. Christopher's hands weren't just gripping the sheets randomly. His fingers were moving in patterns, small, deliberate movements that looked almost like he was trying to communicate. Sarah had taken a few sign language classes in college, mostly out of curiosity. She wasn't fluent, but she recognized the motion. Christopher was signing. He was trying to tell them something, and nobody had noticed. Sarah's heart started racing. She moved closer to the bed, watching his hands carefully. The movements were weak and slow, but they were definitely sign language. She could make out a few words: hurt, inside, help. Sarah looked at Richard Whitmore, whose eyes were closed, head in his hands. She gently touched his shoulder. "Mr. Whitmore, does Christopher know sign language?" Richard looked up, confused. "What? Number? Why would he?" Sarah gestured to the boy's hands. "Because he's signing. He's trying to communicate." Richard stared at his son's hands like he was seeing them for the first time. "That's impossible. Christopher isn't deaf. He could talk perfectly fine before this started." Sarah knelt beside the bed, her mind racing. "Mr. Whitmore, is Christopher able to speak? Has he spoken at all since he got sick?" Richard's face went pale. "No. He hasn't said a single word in 3 weeks. We thought it was because of the pain, that he was too overwhelmed to talk." "But you're saying he can't talk? That he's mute?" Sarah felt pieces clicking together in her mind. Has anyone asked him questions that don't require verbal answers? Has anyone tried to communicate with him non-verbally? Richard looked like he'd been punched. "No. Everyone's been asking him where it hurts, what happened, but he never answers. We all assumed he was just too traumatized or in too much pain to respond." Sarah turned back to Christopher. She gently touched his arm. "Christopher, can you hear me?" The boy's eyes opened slightly. He nodded, just barely. Sarah's sign language was rusty, but she tried. She signed slowly, hoping he'd understand. "Can you tell me where it hurts?" Christopher's eyes widened. For the first time since Sarah had entered the room, he looked directly at her. His hands moved, faster now, more urgent. Sarah could only catch fragments. Stomach, fall, scared boys, nobody. She wished desperately that she was more fluent. "Mr. Whitmore, we need a sign language interpreter. Right now." Richard was already on his phone, barking orders to someone. Within 20 minutes, a professional interpreter arrived. The woman's name was Linda, and she moved to Christopher's bedside with practiced ease. She signed to him, and Christopher responded immediately, his hands moving in rapid, desperate patterns. Linda's face grew increasingly concerned as she translated. "He says his stomach has hurt for weeks. He says he fell. Someone pushed him. He's been trying to tell everyone, but nobody understood." Richard grabbed Linda's arm. "Pushed? Who pushed him? When did this happen?" Linda signed the questions. Christopher's response made his father go white. "He says it was at school. 3 weeks ago, some older boys were bullying him. They pushed him down a flight of stairs. He hit his side on the railing. He's been in pain ever since. He tried to tell you, but you didn't understand. He thought you were angry at him for not talking." Sarah's medical training kicked into overdrive. A fall 3 weeks ago. Impact to the abdomen. Ongoing pain that's been getting worse. "Mr. Whitmore, did Christopher have any bruising after that fall? Any visible injury?" Richard looked stricken. "He had some bruising on his side. We thought it was from sports. He plays soccer. We put ice on it and told him he'd be fine." "Oh God, we told him he'd be fine." Sarah ran out of the room and found Dr. Webb at the nurse's station. "Dr. Webb, the Whitmore boy. He had blunt force trauma to the abdomen 3 weeks ago. Nobody knew because he can't verbally communicate." We need to run tests specifically for internal injuries from that impact." Dr. Webb looked skeptical. "We've done comprehensive scans. There's no indication of trauma." Sarah stood her ground. "He's been signing. He's been trying to tell us. We need to look again, specifically at the impact site." Dr. Webb must have seen something in Sarah's face because he didn't argue further. Within an hour, Christopher was back in imaging, this time with technicians who knew exactly what they were looking for. And there it was, a slow internal bleed from a damaged blood vessel near his spleen. It had been bleeding gradually for weeks, creating a hematoma that was pressing on surrounding organs and nerves. It was in a location that hadn't shown clearly on the general scans because nobody had been looking for trauma specifically in that area. The discovery sent the medical team into immediate action. Christopher needed emergency surgery. The bleeding had to be stopped before it became catastrophic. As they prepped him for the operating room, Richard Whitmore pulled Sarah aside. His eyes were red, his voice breaking. "You saved my son's life. 20 doctors missed this. 20 of the best doctors in the country, but you saw what they didn't. How? How did you know?" Sarah felt tears in her own eyes. "I didn't know, Mr. Whitmore. I just paid attention. I watched him." Everyone was so focused on the technology, on the tests, that nobody was actually looking at Christopher. He was trying so hard to tell you all what happened. He just needed someone to listen in the right way. Richard grabbed her hand. "After the surgery, after he recovers, we need to talk. Please don't disappear. My son needs you." The surgery took 4 hours. The damage was worse than they'd initially thought. The internal bleeding had been slow but persistent, and Christopher had lost a dangerous amount of blood over the past weeks. The surgeon said if they'd waited even another day or two, the boy might not have made it. Sarah waited in the surgical waiting area with Richard, both of them silent, both praying in their own ways. When the surgeon finally emerged and said Christopher would make a full recovery, Richard collapsed into a chair and sobbed like a child. Christopher's recovery was slow but steady. He spent a week in intensive care, then another week in a regular pediatric room. Throughout it all, Sarah made sure she was assigned to his care whenever possible. She learned sign language properly, studying every night, practicing until her hands ached. She wanted to be able to communicate with Christopher freely, to make sure he never felt unheard again. The boy responded to her in ways he didn't with other staff. He'd smile when she entered the room. He'd sign jokes and stories to her. Slowly, the trauma of his ordeal began to fade. 2 weeks after the surgery, when Christopher was finally well enough for serious conversations, Linda, the interpreter, returned. Christopher told them the whole story. The boys at his private school had been bullying him for months because of his muteness. They'd called him freak, dummy, broken. That day, 3 weeks ago, they'd cornered him on the stairs and pushed him, laughing as he tumbled down. Christopher had been too scared and ashamed to tell anyone what really happened. He'd thought if he just stayed quiet, it would go away. The pain had been his secret punishment for being different. Richard listened to his son's story with a face like stone. When Christopher finished, Richard signed to him slowly and carefully with Linda's coaching. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I'm sorry I didn't understand. That will never happen again." Then he turned to Sarah. "I need to speak with you privately." They walked to a quiet conference room. Richard looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. "Sarah, I owe you everything. My son is alive because of you. I want to give you something. Not as payment, because nothing could ever repay this debt, but as a token of my gratitude." He slid an envelope across the table. Sarah opened it, and her breath caught. It was a check for $20 million. She stared at the number, unable to process it. "Mr. Whitmore, I can't accept this. I was just doing my job. Any nurse would have done the same thing." Richard shook his head. "No, they wouldn't have. 20 doctors failed my son. You saved him. And this isn't just about the diagnosis. Christopher trusts you. He responds to you. He's healing because of you." Richard leaned forward, his voice intense. "I don't want to just give you money and have you disappear. I'm asking you to stay, not as his nurse, but as his guardian, his protector, someone who understands him and will make sure he's never voiceless again. I'll pay for you to get any training you want. Speech therapy certification, child psychology, whatever you need. I just need to know that someone who actually sees my son will be there for him. Please." Sarah looked at the check, then at Richard's desperate face. She thought about Christopher, about how his eyes lit up when she entered his room, about how he'd started signing more confidently, how he was beginning to heal not just physically, but emotionally. She thought about the kind of impact she could have on this one child's life if she had unlimited resources and complete support. "Mr. Whitmore, I'll stay, but not for the money. I'll stay because Christopher deserves someone who understands him, someone who'll fight for him. I'll be that person." Richard's relief was palpable. Over the next months, Sarah transitioned from being Christopher's nurse to being something more. She moved into a guest house on the Whitmore estate. She enrolled in advanced courses in child psychology, trauma therapy, and became fluent in American Sign Language. She worked with Christopher every day, helping him process what had happened to him, teaching him that his difference wasn't a weakness, but a unique way of experiencing the world. Christopher blossomed under Sarah's care. He started at a new school, one that specialized in supporting students with different communication needs. He made friends for the first time in his life, other kids who didn't see his muteness as strange. He joined an after-school program for deaf and mute children, learning that he was part of a whole community of people who communicated beautifully without spoken words. His confidence grew. His smile returned. The scared, hurting child Sarah had met in that hospital bed transformed into a happy, secure young boy. Sarah used part of the money Richard had given her to start a foundation. She called it the Silent Voices Project. Its mission was to train healthcare workers in alternative communication methods and to advocate for better support systems for children with communication differences in schools. She gave talks at medical conferences, sharing Christopher's story and emphasizing the critical importance of truly listening to patients, even when they can't speak in traditional ways. 1 year after that first meeting, Sarah sat with Christopher in the Whitmore's garden. He was healthier now, stronger. The physical scars from his surgery had faded. The emotional scars were healing too. Slowly but surely, Christopher signed to her, his movements fluid and confident. "Thank you for hearing me when I couldn't speak." Sarah signed back, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for teaching me how to listen." Richard watched them from the house, still overcome with gratitude and humility every time he saw his son laughing and thriving. He'd learned a hard lesson about the limits of money and power. All his wealth, all his connections, all the best doctors in the world hadn't been able to help his son. But one young nurse with compassion and the willingness to truly see a suffering child had accomplished what seemed impossible. It had taught him that the most valuable things in life can't be bought. They can only be given freely by people who care enough to look beyond the obvious. Christopher started advocating for other kids like him. He worked with Sarah on the Silent Voices project, sharing his story at schools and hospitals. His message was simple but powerful. Everyone has a voice, even if they can't speak. Everyone deserves to be heard. His courage inspired other children with communication differences to speak up in whatever way they could, to demand understanding and accommodation, to refuse to be invisible. The bullies who'd pushed Christopher were expelled from their school. Richard had wanted to press charges, but Christopher had asked him not to. Through Sarah's translation, Christopher explained that he didn't want revenge. He just wanted them to understand what they'd done, how close they'd come to killing him. The boys and their families met with Christopher in a restorative justice session. They apologized. They committed to anti-bullying advocacy. They carried the weight of what their cruelty had nearly caused. Sarah continued working with the Whitmore family, but she also returned to nursing part-time at City Memorial. She wanted to stay connected to the front lines of patient care, to keep encountering children who needed someone to really see them. Her colleagues noticed a change in her approach. She spent more time observing, less time rushing. She paid attention to the small details other people missed. She became known as the nurse who could connect with difficult patients, the one who could solve mysteries that stumped everyone else. Christopher's relationship with his father deepened in ways neither had expected. Richard learned sign language fluently, spent more time actually communicating with his son instead of just providing for him. They discovered shared interests and inside jokes. They built a relationship based on understanding rather than assumptions. Richard scaled back his work commitments, realizing that no business achievement mattered more than being present for his son. Wealth had given him everything, except what mattered most, and almost cost him the person he loved most in the world. 5 years after that first meeting, Christopher was 15 years old and thriving. He'd become an accomplished artist, expressing himself through painting in ways words never could. His artwork appeared in galleries, with proceeds benefiting organizations that supported children with disabilities. He'd written a book, with Sarah's help, about his experience. It became required reading in medical schools across the country, a powerful reminder about the importance of patient-centered care and alternative communication. Sarah had gotten engaged to a pediatric surgeon she'd met at a Silent Voices project conference. They planned to continue the work together, maybe even adopt children with special needs. She'd found her calling in the most unexpected way, and it had given her a life richer than she'd ever imagined. The money Richard had given her had certainly helped, but it wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the connection, the purpose, the knowledge that she'd made a real difference in a child's life. On the 5th anniversary of Christopher's surgery, the Whitmores hosted a celebration at their home. Friends, family, doctors who'd treated Christopher, kids from his school, everyone who'd been part of his journey. Christopher stood in front of the group and signed a speech that Sarah voiced for him. He talked about almost dying, about being voiceless and invisible, about the nurse who'd seen him when nobody else could. He talked about learning that difference wasn't disability, that communication came in many forms, that being heard was a human right, not a privilege. At the end of his speech, Christopher turned to Sarah. He signed something he'd been practicing for weeks, something he wanted to get exactly right. "You saved my life by listening to my silence. You gave me a voice by understanding I didn't need to speak to be heard. You showed me that being different made me special, not broken. I love you, not because you're paid to care for me, but because you chose to see me as a person worth hearing. Thank you for teaching the world how to listen. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Richard hugged his son, both of them holding on like they'd never let go. Sarah stood there, overwhelmed by the journey they'd all taken together. She thought about that first day in Christopher's hospital room, how she'd almost walked away like everyone told her to, how she'd almost ignored those small hand movements she didn't quite understand. One small moment of attention, of curiosity, of caring enough to look closer. That's all it had taken to change everything. The party continued into the evening, full of laughter and joy and celebration of life. Christopher played with his friends, signing jokes and stories, completely comfortable in his own skin. Richard pulled Sarah aside one more time. I've said thank you 1,000 times, and it's still not enough. You gave me my son back. You gave him his life back. You changed everything. Sarah smiled. You gave me something too, Mr. Whitmore. You showed me what nursing could really be. Not just treating symptoms, but actually healing people, seeing them, hearing them, understanding them. Christopher didn't need a miracle cure. He just needed someone to listen. We all need that. As the celebration wound down and guests began leaving, Sarah sat with Christopher one last time that evening. He signed to her, asking if she'd ever regret taking his case, if she'd ever wished she'd just done her job and moved on like everyone expected. Sarah signed back without hesitation. Being part of your life has been the greatest privilege of mine. You taught me more than I ever taught you. You showed me that strength comes in many forms, that communication transcends words, that listening is the most powerful thing we can do for each other. I didn't save you, Christopher. We saved each other. Christopher hugged her tight, and Sarah felt the truth of those words in her bones. This hadn't been a one-way rescue. She'd been drifting before this, unsure if nursing was really her calling, wondering if she'd made the right career choice. Christopher had given her purpose, direction, a reason to wake up every morning excited about the work ahead. They'd needed each other in ways neither could have predicted. And that connection, that mutual healing and growth, was worth more than any amount of money could ever buy. The story of Sarah Chen and Christopher Whitmore became legendary in medical circles. It was taught in nursing schools as an example of patient-centered care done right. It was shared in hospitals as a reminder about the importance of looking beyond test results and technology. It inspired countless healthcare workers to slow down, to observe more carefully, to remember that every patient has a story if you're willing to listen for it. And most importantly, it gave hope to families struggling to communicate with children who experienced the world differently, showing them that being heard was always possible if someone cared enough to learn the right language. If Sarah and Christopher's story moved you, if it made you think about the power of actually listening to people who communicate differently, I need you to subscribe right now. Next week, I'm sharing the story of the doctor who discovered a patient's life-threatening condition by noticing something nobody else saw in a routine appointment. What she found will blow your mind. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever felt unheard? Have you ever had someone truly listen to you when no one else would? Smash that like button and let's keep telling stories about people who see what others miss. See you next week.